Hey guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I am your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Mike Murry on the show. This is Mike's first time on the show. He is a writer for Examine. I've spoken about examine.com many times. You may not be aware of it, but they are a fantastic resource for supplement information, and they're not sponsored, they have no biases, they just look at the research and disseminate that for you guys. He writes for them, so that puts him on like high credibility, right? He's also a registered dietitian, he's a certified strength and conditioning specialist, a competitive bodybuilder, and I knew of Mike through the Muscle Memoir podcast that he used to run. And yeah, I mean, I was actually on his show too, which is really cool because now he's on the Revive Stronger show. And it was a really, really fun chat. We dug into initially just his background, what got him into competitive bodybuilding, how did his recent contest prep go. I always find it interesting to talk to people who compete, but also keep their eye on the literature to see if they use any of the evidence that's come out to inform their practice when they compete. And he did use some of it with the Chris Barakat paper on peaking for bodybuilding show. And he used that to influence one of his peaks, and we dig into that and how did that go. And then one of the things that he did during his contest prep was he introduced an intra-workout. So I just dug into kind of what the rationale was there and what maybe the practical application might be for other individuals that are considering this kind of peri, intra-workout nutrition. And then we dig into some of that, like what supplementation does he consider to be efficacious for like pre-workout. We talk a little bit about caffeine, nitrate, beta-alanine, and just overall a really fun discussion with Mike here that I think you guys will really enjoy. And he'll definitely be back on to talk a bit more about his training and some training related topics. But as a reminder, if you aren't already subscribed to the podcast, please do subscribe. Please do leave us a comment, a review, any of that good stuff. Share it across social media. All of it is highly appreciated, and it allows the podcast to grow and reach a wider audience and educate further people, but also keeps us making sure we produce the highest quality content possible. Without further ado though, let's get into the show. Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Mike Murry on the show. And I first discovered Mike from the Muscle Memoir podcast. And actually, we were just talking off air, and I was on his podcast, and embarrassingly, I'd actually forgotten that somehow, even though I knew your podcast and I've listened to, I think, the vast majority of the episodes, which was a really good podcast, very similar to Revive Strong in terms of the guests that are being interviewed. So it's really cool that I can bring you on to chat, because I actually reached out to a lot of the kind of listeners will be aware of examine.com, potentially Kamal, who came on the podcast. I believe it was Kamal who I had on. And I just reached out and was like, hey, is there anyone on the Examine team? Because I'm aware there's a big team at Examine who you think would be like a great person to have on the podcast. Because I'm always looking for new great minds to have on the show. And he obviously promoted yourself. And I was like, oh yeah, of course, Mike does work behind the scenes. Well, more so behind the scenes for Examine. And so, yeah, it all came together that now I have Mike on my show, which is really nice. So yeah, I don't know where to start with all of that, but I'm actually interested. How did you start working with examine.com, Mike?
My introduction to working at Examines, pretty interesting, at least with respect to like, you know, how people typically get a job. So I found out about an opening at Examine through Twitter. Kamal basically made a tweet and said, hey, we're looking for, you know, people who are really interested in nutrition science. They have an educational background in the field. But then he put in this little context and he said, but these are people who wouldn't consider themselves as experts per se, right? And interestingly enough, I made this thread like literally a week beforehand on Twitter saying why I don't think registered dietitians are nutrition professionals, right? And so I'm a registered dietitian, so I'm fully aware of like the, you know, what's required to become one. And basically my point was that to be an expert in anything, it requires like this insane level of knowledge about something super specific. And nutrition is way too diverse of a field to be considered a nutrition expert, right? And you'll see this all the time with dietitians, right? Like So dietitians, traditionally work in a clinical setting in a hospital. They treat all kinds of different patients, right? But then you'll see people who have they pursue further certifications in things like diabetes or cancer, right? And it's like, dietitians at baseline can work with these sorts of patients, but then there are people who are like experts in treating those types of patients, right? So I talked about things like sports nutrition or like just like protein specifically, right? Like one single nutrient, right? It's like, oh, well, like Don Layman or Stu Phillips are experts in protein. So when I reflect on all of this as a dietitian, I'm like, hey, like I know a lot about nutrition and different aspects of nutrition, but I don't think I'm an expert in anything. And I was like, so I'm someone who fits this criteria. Like I'm not an expert, I'm very interested in nutrition science. I'm a registered dietitian. And basically through that, Kamal ended up reaching out. We had some discussions, I had an interview, and then I ended up joining Examine about maybe like 2 years ago.
Very cool. Yeah, it's such an interesting. I could see almost people being put off, being like, "Oh, you don't want experts." Like they feel like they have that. Like I am an expert. Like surely, like it feels like they would want an expert, but actually, when you frame it in the way you framed it, I kind of quite like that. And I guess it's like we spoke off air. You feel like, okay, nutrition's so large, you're kind of a bit of a generalist in that area versus like being specific down one line. But yeah, I agree with you. I think probably far too many people consider themselves like experts, where it's like actually, like when I think of an expert, there's very few names that come to mind, and normally it's specifically about one thing. And then I don't know, you get people who, and I think that's been spoken about recently because the podcast scene has kind of exploded, and you'll get names who are like, hey, they're an expert in this field, but then they consider themselves like they start talking about broader topics. It's like, then you see cracks appearing because they quickly show that they really don't know what they're talking about, which is, I mean, why you try and stay in your lane a little bit. And it sounds like you respect that quite a lot. And I expect also, at least this is the way I feel, especially after being like a podcast host and talking to so many experts and people like who know so much, and you just realize like the Dunning-Kruger effect, you're definitely past that. And you're like in this position where you're like, I really know, and I'm aware of what I don't know. And, but like you said, also, you have to know a lot even to be able to talk to an expert and kind of converse with them, which you were certainly very good at on your podcast. So yeah, I mean, I respect examine.com so highly, just because the supplement industry is so fraught with just charlatans and complete crap, basically. So anyone who works for them or like is in with them, I think like they must like hold to a high standard. So it to me means like, hey, they really respect Mike here. So I think lots of people should be respecting you and the work that you're doing.
Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. Yeah, the Examine team is phenomenal. There's about 30 of us. It's like literally the kindest, smartest people I've ever had the pleasure of interacting with. It almost makes me like I've joked at times about how like I'm the dumbest person at Examine. Like that's just like how these people almost make you feel. And it's like we're all generalists, right? Like very few of us specialize in anything. Like I'm here because considering the content of your podcast, right? It's like, there is this specific need, like we're interested in nutrition, supplementation, exercise science, but it's like within these specific subcategories of those fields. And it's like, hey, like Mike is kind of our representative meathead at Examine, right? Like he kind of fits the criteria here. I make the sports nutrition quizzes every month at Examine. So like when it comes to those questions, like I tend to do a lot more of the study summaries and articles in those fields, but it's not all I do. It's actually like a small percentage of what I do. Like within any given week, I'm writing about, liver health and diabetes and cardiovascular disease and all of these different conditions, which, are affected by our diet and supplementation regimens. So it's like, none of us are really experts in anything per se, but everyone is just like super smart at Examine. So it really is a pleasure to work here and to interact with those people on a daily basis.
You mentioned the word meathead, and that actually brings us to our first kind of topic here, because we haven't actually mentioned it, but you're a competitive bodybuilder. I believe this was your second season that you've just finished. Like how long ago did you step off stage now? you well and truly recovered, or how are you feeling?
So I think this is my 10th week post competitive season. It's like, I don't know, it's my second competitive season, but it's the first time I stepped on stage. And that's because my first rodeo was in like 2019. So I basically dieted for 22 weeks, was like a month out from my first show. And then, COVID happened and everything got canceled. So that kind of like, it left a bad taste in my mouth. And I just like, I really wanted to get back on stage, but then also it was like, I really wanted to improve my look, right? Like I really wanted to improve my overall muscularity. So I ended up taking a few years off to improve. And then, yeah, so this was my first like real contest prep. But like I basically went through like the whole thing in 2019. I just didn't get to make it on stage. But at this point, 10 weeks post contest, how am I feeling? Uh like I'm almost back to normal. So last week or 2 weeks ago was the first week where I hit like an average sleep duration of 7 hours per night. And like I was pumped and I was like, I'm coming. Like it's finally time to get back to like productive training, to put on some muscle. And then I ended up getting hit with like an upper respiratory tract infection and a back injury at the same time. So I've been derailed for like a week and a half, which is just like really took the wind out of my sails. Cause I'm like, finally, I feel pretty good again. Like I can be productive in the gym. And I got smacked with this. So like getting better, but like I'm not 100% there yet.
Yeah, I think like 10 weeks, depending if you take, did you use like a recovery diet type of approach, quite an assertive? Are you quite considerably heavier than your stage weight? How did you go about that process?
Oh, for sure. So like I just wanted to get out of that deficit ASAP, right? And it's like, of course, like there are better and worse ways to go about that, right? Like we don't want to put on, excessive amounts of fat. But at the end of the day, like I'm not going to feel better. Like hormone levels, sleep are not going to get better until I put a significant amount of fat on this body. So I was pretty aggressive coming out. Um, I guess I would say I was like mainly influenced by Berto's recovery diet, like what he posted from his most recent. So basically, the goal was to put on like 10 pounds in a month. And at this point, I'm up about 15, 17 pounds from like stage weight. And that's over 10 weeks. Like, it's fine with me. Like, I was just at the point where it's like, I don't know, I'm just like not attached to the look when it comes to competing. Like, I don't really care. Like, so I was just like, hey, I want to get back to productive training as soon as possible. Also, like, I'm someone whose sleep gets like really messed up in prep. Like, it happens to everyone at some point, but I'm like extremely sensitive to it. And it probably like if I get just a little too assertive with the deficit, you know, my sleep will take a hit. And then also I feel like the like level of body fat where my sleep starts to take a hit is probably higher than most people, so I have no idea. These are just like random numbers, but let's say like most people, once they get to like around 7-8% body fat, like the sleep starts taking a hit. Mine is probably like a few percentage points higher. So like I had like a 30-week contest prep in total, maybe a little bit longer. And my sleep was pretty bad for like 4 months. Whereas for most people, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong here, like based on everything you've noticed with clients and everything else, I feel like most people like maybe 2 months, maybe 1 month. But for me, it's like twice that amount of time with disrupted sleep. That's not good.
Yeah, man, for me, at least again, from the people I've spoken to and when like anecdotally from what I see online, most people, the sleep and then poor energy levels and like just no like energy for anything in life are the worst symptoms. It's not the hunger, it's not like feeling cold, it's like having no energy, and that's coupled with terrible sleep. And yeah, I would say most people sleep, they can hold on to it for the vast majority of the time. And I think you're probably towards that slight extreme of, unfortunately, it getting hit a little bit earlier, because I assume you do all the things that you know you should be doing. Like
Right.
you're aware of sleep hygiene and caffeine and everything like that. Some people aren't, and I think they're probably in a maybe even a better position than you are, because they just have that genetic kind of capability or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, that's interesting. And also, yeah, it makes, as soon as you were kind of talking through that, again, it's very individual, that post-show period, and where I think it's been, we still talk about body fat settling points, but I think it's been reframed as like this lower and upper intervention point almost. And it's like, it sounds like your lower intervention point is just a bit higher than your average person. So you're saying like maybe 8-10% is for some guys, but for you it's like 12-14%. So you need to kind of, what might look like a bit more of an assertive rebound to you is like, that's actually just typical for me. Whereas for someone else could be like, oh, I could gain half that amount of weight in that time, feel fine. It's just that kind of individual variation that you see person to person. And oh, sorry.
No, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I actually skipped a beat. I don't know how quickly you can go through this, but I actually was interested to see how initially you even got into bodybuilding. Like when you said this was your second season, what led you wanting to compete at your first season? I'm always interested, especially because I think you're a similar age to me. You like coming up to 30 or something like that. It's like influences are often similar.
Yeah, you're correct. So I am 26. So honestly, like a lot of the rationale behind my first competitive season was simply because I could have competed as a junior. And I felt like I could have done some real damage as a junior. And then also, so if that wasn't the case, if I couldn't have competed as a junior that season, I probably wouldn't have competed at all. And that's just because the whole point of competing for me is literally because I enjoy competition. So something I often tell people when it comes to bodybuilding is that I'm interested in competitive bodybuilding simply because I love the bodybuilding lifestyle. I love lifting weights. I like the nutrition side of things. I even like the suffering involved in contest prep and seeing the changes that correspond with that. But I don't like getting on stage. I don't like posing. I don't care for any of it. I'm just someone who loves lifting weights and wants to express that love through something competitive. And the outlets for that are basically bodybuilding and powerlifting. And I used to compete in powerlifting. I did relatively well as a powerlifter at a local level. So overall, I was a pretty bad powerlifter. But I dealt with some injuries, ones which like still bother me to this day. And for that reason, I just didn't want to be pigeonholed into those movements anymore. And it was like, so this is the outlet that's left. It is, getting on stage in the posing trunks and getting out there. And it's like, yeah, like exactly to what I thought. I didn't really like being on stage. I actually didn't really like the process of competing whatsoever. It was just kind of like the end product of doing something that I wanted to do. So I guess I didn't really have a good reason for why I got into bodybuilding specifically. It was just like, hey, I'm on this path. Love the path. I love walking down this path. But it's like, where does the path lead to? And it's like, I guess it's this. And it's like, it's like almost like I got to the top of the mountain and like I got the view, right? And I was like, it's not even that good of a view. Like just climbing up the mountain was way cooler and way more enjoyable.
I appreciate the honesty because, yeah, I think people can tend to glorify competing where it's like this amazing experience for everyone and you should be loving your time on stage. But I mean, there's a lot of annoying things about actually going on stage, like the travel, the tan, the shaving, again, the posing. Like it's like I enjoy seeing myself look cool in poses, but the actual like it's a lot of homework and like study you have to do to become a good poser. And some people love that, like posing to music. this is not something I personally love either. So I relate to you there for sure.
I'm actually really interested to hear your perspective. So to your point, do you personally like enjoy being on stage? Like do you really enjoy that or no?
So yeah, it's a good question. I do, but unfortunately, it does depend on how competitive I am on stage. So if I'm
Okay.
on stage, and in the past I was not very competitive, like I would be on there and I'd be very clueless to how I did. And now I really understand, like, if you're
Hmm.
in the first call outs, if you're in the middle, like, how you're doing. The ignorance was kind of bliss in the past, whereas now I really know. So I've been on stage before, and when I know I'm not really competing for like a top 5 placing or top
Hmm.
3 placing, like it's not the most fun thing, especially when you're just like stood at the back watching those guys compete for that top 5, and you're like, hey, damn. Fortunately enough, like I've been fortunate enough with my last season, I tend to be in the mix, but and that makes it fun, like competing against others. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's the thing that I think of often is, they have the pose down at the
Right.
end.
Hmm.
I never enjoy that part. So I think there's like, if you don't enjoy that part, you probably don't love the stage experience like the most. Whereas some people, you just see them, they're loving the whole time. They're posing the entire time, like they're getting in the mix, they're like shoving everyone. I'm just like at the side, like, okay, you guys, do I have to hit some poses? Like, really?
Dude, I couldn't agree more. Like I've never been interested in having an individual routine. Um, I really gave it the old college try, this for this season, just like, hey, you're not really interested in this, but like put your all into it and like see if you do like it. And like for my one show, like I had this choreographed routine, did the whole thing, and I just like thought about it after. I'm like, I really don't like that, like whatsoever, like, you know what I mean, like I tried to like embody like Terrence Ruffin and be like, no, 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 you really do enjoy um this creative part of bodybuilding, and you're gonna get into it and you're gonna like it, like you just have to get it, like you just think you don't like it. It's like, no, 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 I put my all into that. I really tried to convince myself that this is what I enjoyed, and I just like I didn't, like I have no interest in individual routines or anything else, which then I take a step back and I'm like, so should you really be bodybuilding if like you don't like posing, you don't like this, like why even get on stage? And then I'm like, I don't know. So then I'm like, do other people feel like I do? Or like, should I just like step away from this world? So when I hear you say stuff like that, I'm like, oh, like you're not too
Yeah.
different from me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way about the individual routine. It just doesn't come easily to me, and it's nothing I like. I don't know if this influences it, but I don't have the best flow and shape. So like when I see myself hitting
Same.
I could hit Terrence Ruffins poses, and I'm like, that just looks terrible on me. I can't hit this pose. So I'm just like, man, I have to like choreograph this in a way and like contort myself to somehow have like some decent looking posing going on. I'm just glad it's not judged. But I do, again, it's great for photos because this is the time where the professional
Right.
photographer can like get all the good shots of you. So I'm like, hey, I need to hit some good shots so I can like have those, because that's kind of your reward big time at the end of it. It doesn't matter where you
Hmm.
place, and when you look back, you don't look back at the trophies. You're really looking back like, hey, the photos, like, oh man, I got real shredded or whatever it
Right.
might be. And I'm with you where I try powerlifting and I kind of think of it like, hey, this is like chicken, rice, and broccoli, and I have to eat this for life. But like bodybuilding is like flexible dieting. Like I can hit so many different foods and enjoy. Like I'm
Yes.
definitely going to enjoy this exercise variation and like this freedom to just do so many different things.
Hmm.
So yeah, bodybuilding. I reckon there's a number of listeners who feel similar to us, where it's just like, hey, they don't love the time on stage, but they
Hmm.
need that competitive outlet for
Right.
themselves. So yeah, I've never really thought about it like that, but yeah, you brought that out in me. How so in terms of the prep, I'm always interested, especially for people who like clearly you're very invested in the science, evidence-based practice. How did you use any kind of tools that you hadn't used in previous preps that you used this time around, like refeeds, diet breaks, or kind of anything within your peaking strategy that was different, that was like based off the literature?
So in my first prep, I actually never ended up practicing peaking because again, I was like 4 weeks out. It was basically like It was basically like around the time where I was like a week out from like a practice run is when I found out like all my shows were canceled. I remember having this conversation with a colleague and he was like, dude, just like stick it out and like get that experience. But I'm also not convinced that like, you know, a successful peak from 4 years ago would extend and have any application to my physiology, the next go around. So I was just like, yeah, I'm just gonna like eat a pizza. And that was it. So I never practiced peaking. And then this time around, to be honest, like I had a lot of difficulty with peaking. Um, Peaking is something that like always made me nervous about bodybuilding, and that like kind of bothered me, where it was like the fact that your body becomes so fickle to the point where, just like slight nutrient adjustments, timing can like really impact how you look, obviously. So I wanted to be like conservative with my adjustments, but then also I ran into some other issues, which we might come back to. So that I ended up getting a little more experimental, and I played around with actually the peaking protocol that Chris Bearcat published. Did you read that paper?
With the fat loading, like to fill
Yeah.
the like triglyceride stores. Yes, I had Scott Stevenson was on that paper, and I had Scott on to kind of talk through it. So yeah, I also practiced a little bit of fat loading my last prep.
Yeah.
Based off that.
So there's the review paper, which is Chris Scott, Guillermo Escalante is on there too, I believe. But then there's also just a case study, and it's just Chris, and that's been published, where it was like his specific macros and like electrolyte consumption, fluids, and everything else. So I like combined both those and looked at those, and I thought it was pretty interesting. And I ended up playing around with that. And actually, my best look I achieved was when I ran that protocol. I only did it once, and then I ended up trying to do something a bit less dynamic and keep more variables steady, because that was like yeah, there was like 3 or 4 days of like pretty low carb intake and fat loading, so the higher fat intake, and then basically you just swap that to the point where carbohydrate loading into the show. And like it's not that complex per se, because like, so for me, I did implement refeeds during prep, so I had a good idea of what those carbohydrate loading days were supposed to be. um which again, like a problem I ran into is that those numbers, which on my refeed days were adequate, ended up not being adequate when I ran this protocol, which was super weird. Which was like I ended up needing like 200 grams of carbs and more to even get close to filling out. And I was like, what is what is going on? So basically, one of the issues I ran into with prep is that my look was like really unpredictable. One of that was because of the peaking protocol. Another one was because I ran into like issues with edema. So my lower
Sure.
body was just like swelled up like a balloon for basically like the last few months of prep. And it got to the point where um I had to like bring down my leg training volume, and I was training them once per week, which is fine, but I was only doing like a couple of hard sets per body part. There were times where I literally had to like lock myself in my room and like not go outside for a walk, because like it was just like, dude, like you can't tolerate any more lower body fatigue. So basically, it got to the point where like I could only assess my visual progress accurately like once a week,
Wow.
when I was recovered from lower body training, where I had like a lower cardio day. And then it would be like, oh, okay, there's a separation in your legs, and like this happened and these changes. So like all of those things combined, and I was just like, I don't even know what to do with this body at this point. It is just not it is just not going along with what I want to do. So yeah, prep was an interesting experience, kind of a disaster from some points. Peaking, played around with different strategies, like the things I mentioned, and then yeah, I definitely utilized refeeds, but those didn't come in until I was like, I don't know, like 2/3 of the way through prep. Outside of that, it was just like regular intake, same thing every day, and then just like incrementally coming down. It wasn't until I got like objectively lean that I started implementing those.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And man, the word unpredictable, for me at least, as a bodybuilding coach and as a competitor, that is the biggest nightmare when you're dealing. Like, if I'm dealing with a client and I'm like, I make this change and then like I can't be certain what the outcome is. That's the like I'm always like, with peak weeks for me, I love predictability. I'm like, I make this change, it does this. I know exactly what was the change because, like you said, keep many variables under control. So yeah, I've kind of moved a little bit away from any peaking strategies that manipulate too many variables because I'm just like, I can't be sure what change led to what. And I think for some people, the stress of the unknown in that scenario is not worth it to them for the potential upside. So yeah, and to your, I agree with you completely. When you practice peaks, like it has to be so so close to already you're competing because your physiology is changing on a like week to week basis, and so you can't practice a peak and just like copy and paste and be like yeah just work just follow that.
Yeah, to your point about like predictability, so the protocol outlined by Bearcat and colleagues is like, it's dynamic, but I felt it was worth experimenting with. I felt like I had the data and an understanding of what was going on nutritionally where I could implement it reasonably well. And I did implement it reasonably well. But something, as I was looking at different peaking strategies and reminding myself of something I found terrifying was Cliff Wilson's rapid backloading, where I was like, this is so interesting, but I just like couldn't commit myself to even experimenting with it just because of like how aggressive it is and like how much could potentially gone wrong. Have you ever tried utilizing that with yourself or with clients?
No, with clients, not yet actually. I have a client who is going to WNBF Worlds and we're experimenting with it this week because weigh-ins, I believe weigh-ins is like 2 days before or something, and he's right on the cusp of like the lightweights basically, and we're like, you want to be a heavy lightweight versus like a light medium or whatever it might be. So I was like, hey, we've got time. He's damn lean at the moment. So I was just like, you're a prime candidate. He responds really well to carbs. He doesn't like look soft when you start carving him. He just looks better and better like the more you give him. So I was like, hey, so we're experimenting with a rapid backload this week, and then if it goes well, we're just like run that week to week and then into Worlds for the reason of making weight. But it's not, I'm similar to you. I'm very conservative for the most part with my peaking, and I did consider it for 2021. But I'm also maybe similar to you where I'm quite a stressful wearing, like I like knowing how things are going. So I tended to much prefer like a slow backload. So even like a progressive linear load through the week. So just raising carbs every day. And that kind of, I don't know, for me, who's a bit of a stress head, I don't know, a rapid backload, unless I had practiced it quite a few times, it would kind of, I'd be nervous about it.
Yeah, that was the incremental increase during the week was something I utilized for my other two shows. And it was just like, like I had the data there for my refeeds where it's like, hey, like when you increase by this much, you look like this on the second day of the refeed, you look like this on the day after the refeed. You look like this, when you go back to a normal intake after 2 days of refeeding. And it's just like, so when did you look best? Did you look best on the second day of the refeed, after a lower day, after 2 days of refeeding? And it's like, I had that data, and like, it made for, again, like, I think my best look was when I utilized the Bearcat protocol. But, with that said, the more consistent approach is definitely like less stress and anxiety behind that, because I had all of that data from the weeks prior where I could be like, like I more or less know how I'm going to look utilizing this.
Yeah, it's kind of weighing up the risk versus reward for various things. So I guess if you got any, I know it's so close because you just competed, but do you already have ideas of where you want to go in future? Like, do you have like a date in mind, or is it more of a case of, hey, I'm just focusing on like building more muscle now?
Definitely the latter. I don't know. It's something I've thought a lot about after the competitive season. It was like, so it didn't go well. I didn't place well. And I'm fine with sharing why. It was like something I expected. So like I already mentioned how from like an overall muscularity perspective, like, I'm definitely for my height, because I'm about 5'10", and my stage weight was carved up like 159, 160. Lowest I got in prep was like
Okay.
155. I think we're around like the same height, right?
I'm also 5'10", so
And
yeah,
what's your stage weight?
I was around 170, carved up, like up to 175 on one of the show days, which was like, I don't know what happened there. I was just like, man, that's heavy. So
Yeah. So to my point, you got a lot more muscle than I do, and I need a lot more muscle. And I competed in classic, and basically, like, I got feedback from the judges at the show where I looked the best. At my first show, they just like didn't answer me. That's interesting. And at the second one, every single judge said the same thing, and it was something I already knew. And it was like, "Hey, man, like your upper body's small." That's basically what they said, and I was like, "I know that. I know that." Like back when I was a mediocre powerlifter, I had a good squat, solid deadlift, and my bench sucked. And it was like, "Oh yeah, by the way, like you have like the smallest chest, delts, and triceps out of everyone competing in this weight class." So like, what a surprise! So, like, you know what I mean? As a body, it's like, yeah, everybody's still small. I mean, one of the judges even was like, "Hey man, like your lower body kind of overpowers your upper body," and it's just like, especially in classic, like that's not a
yeah.
good look. If anything, your upper should overpower your lower in classic. Like that would be preferred. So yeah, that wasn't great. But it's something I've thought a lot about in terms of my future plans. And like, I don't know, maybe I'll get back on stage. Like maybe I won't. Like I didn't do well, but when I think about, what if I did get my pro card this season? Would that have changed anything? And I don't think it would have. Like I wouldn't have felt better about the season. I probably still would have been like, I didn't like being on stage. Traveling was annoying.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, going to tanning the day before and then tanning the morning of, and like all these little things, like still wouldn't have liked it. Like honestly, so I guess that's a sign in itself, right? The fact, like I remember when my first contest prep got shut down, when that ended, while I was eating that pizza, I was like, I can't wait to get into the off season and like build all this muscle. And I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna get on that stage and like it's gonna be lights out and be so much better than I was the first time. And I just like got done with this one and I was like, yeah. And it's like, so like you didn't do well and like you do this for competition. Like, aren't you like fired up? And I'm like, no, like I don't really care. Like, so maybe it'll come back to me in like 4 years. And it's like, even if I did plan on competing again, it would be like a 4-year off season because
Sure.
my upper body needs to get significantly bigger to do well. And if I'm not going to do well, I don't really want to be on stage anyway. You know what I mean? So it's like the fact that the off season would be pretty long, even if I did want to get back to competing, it's just like, I'm going to do the same stuff I would have did anyway, regardless of whether I wanted to get back on stage in the future or not. So like, just like, I'm just going to train and eat in a progressive manner, like I always do. And we'll see if, the spark comes back. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But like, whatever, we want to call a bodybuilder, right? Whether that's someone who has like, that's almost like a side tangent, right? Like if you don't compete in bodybuilding, are you a bodybuilder? It's like, I don't know, but it's like, if we just call someone who consistently lives the lifestyle of a bodybuilder, then it's just like, yeah, I'm going to keep being a bodybuilder, irrespective of whether I plan on getting back on stage or not.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, no, I find it funny when people are like really, like, I don't know, it's like some bodybuilders like, no, if you don't compete, you're not a bodybuilder. It's like, why do you care so much about this term? Like, call yourself a competitive bodybuilder if you want. Like, I don't know, like bodybuilding is not really contest prep in many ways. So yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from. And I think there's probably a lot of people, even potentially listening, done their season and they're not thrilled with how it went either. And they, you kind of, when you're that lean, you really get to see where your weaknesses are and also your strengths. Like you said, your legs are definitely a strong point. And it just then gives you a bit of a focus and like, hey, whether you're gonna compete in future or not, you're still going to invest heavily into this thing. Because like you said, you don't, I think the saying goes, we don't like train and eat and do all of this to compete. We compete because we do the lifestyle type of thing. And
100%.
Some people just choose not to take it there. And yeah, who knows if you like, hey, you're feeling yourself, you're like, my upper body has definitely come on a lot. Like, the time, you got a stress-free year or something, diet down and take the stage again. So that's cool. Right. A question I did have for you, actually, I think is interesting because we've mostly talked about your experience, which I personally just like indulging myself. But something you did do was you added an intra-workout, which I think is interesting because it's not something I don't think has been spoken about much on this podcast at all, and I haven't heard it spoken about just a ton recently, is like intra-workout nutrition. And I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts surrounding why you decided to implement some intra-workout nutrition and maybe your thoughts just generally on practical kind of application if people are thinking, hey, should I be taking one too?
Yeah. So the reason I started implementing intra-workout nutrition was because I think just generally speaking, when you're in that depleted state during contest prep, the peri-workout window, what you're consuming within that period of time probably becomes more important. That's something I've noticed where it's like in the off season, it's like, oh, I haven't eaten in 4 hours. It's like, I'm just going to go lift. And like, I don't think twice about it. Whereas when I'm like in a very depleted state, it's just like, I ate 2 hours ago and I didn't start working out yet. Like, is my performance going to suck? And it's like, actually, based on experience, it is going to kind of suck. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're literally going to be hungry during your workout, and that's distracting. I think there's actually like, there's one paper that more or less, it was like one of those like breakfast studies, right? Where they compared like eating something to placebo and like a viscous. So the placebo is like basically like this viscous, like non-energy containing mush, and they compared it to like a control that didn't consume anything. And basically like one of the reasons they think that you see similar performance in people who like actually consume calories and people who consume something that didn't contain many calories is basically like they felt full after, right? Like they weren't hungry during the workout. So they think like that could be one of the mechanisms explaining why we didn't see a difference in performance for those conditions. So I think the peri-workout window becomes more important when you're in a depleted state, like when you're consuming nutrition. And I think intra-workout, you know, it increases in importance. Is there direct data, you know, showing that an intra-workout in certain conditions increases resistance exercise performance specifically? Like sort of, not really. In 2022, there was a meta-analysis published. I believe Helms was one of the authors in the paper. And I think they combined studies that had participants either consume something pre-workout or consume something intra-workout or both. So kind of removes like the granularity, right? Because we're combining all of those studies. But basically, they showed that carbohydrate consumption pre/intra-workout increased the amount of volume performed, particularly in studies where it was compared, particularly in studies where the session duration was at least 45 minutes. Also, there was this correlation with like the number of hard sets performed. So the more like hard sets to failure you perform, the more likely it is you're going to see a benefit in performance from like that pre-intra-workout carbohydrate intake. And then the other moderating variable was the amount of time fasted. So if if there was an overnight fast of at least 8 hours beforehand, right, then carbohydrate consumption became more influential on performance. And that like makes sense, right? It's like, if you wake up and it's just like one person ate like a 500 calorie breakfast containing like, 50, 75 grams of carbs, and the other person just trained fasted, like it's really not all that surprising that the carbohydrates help there. And then also there's some interesting research in studies that they didn't have the participants consume the carbohydrates per se. They just had them swish around in their mouth a carbohydrate containing solution and then spit it out. And there's actually a few studies that showed that when you have a carbohydrate mouth rinse in a fasted state, that improves performance compared to people who just fasted. So even when like you're not actually consuming the carbohydrates, there's an improvement in performance there. And it seems like the hypothesis is, and I think there's like decent enough evidence to support this, is that just the presence of carbohydrate in the mouth stimulates these regions in the brain associated basically like with the reward system. So the presence of carbohydrate in the mouth can increase motivation, decrease rating of perceived exertion. And basically that's the mechanism resulting in this effect of improved performance. So when I consider all of that data, right, I mean, being like 16, 20 weeks into contest prep, like, I don't know, are you just like, you're in this depleted state all the time, right? So it's like after an overnight fast, like liver glycogen is depleted, specifically like glycogen levels are going to be lower. And it's like glycogen levels are just like permanently lowered during prep. I don't think it's far-fetched to think that, these sorts of interventions, their magnitude of effect would increase. And my anecdotal experience is that I felt like I had a little more during my sessions when I was having an intra-workout shake. I felt, that my focus during my session, whereas it would start to fall off like after the first two exercises, and I was like 35 minutes, like I just had a little more where it wasn't as much of a bad time, doing those latter exercises, getting those few extra sets and getting a sufficient volume in. And yeah, even on like the first couple of exercises in the session, on like, like the third set of like the first exercise or something like that, it seemed to me when I looked at my data that, I was getting an extra rep that like wasn't just a consequence of like last week's work leading into an increase. It seemed to be, based on the trends of the data, that like I was getting a little something extra from that intra-workout carbohydrate intake.
I think you answered that question really, really well. And if I was only to summarize it, it was the point you kind of started out with, was like, hey, if you're in a glycogen depleted state and you have some carbohydrates that can then be stored or kind of come in as muscle glycogen, then it's probably going to help that person in that scenario. So I know, intra-workouts, some people are like, hey, they're not evidence-based, and other people like, a lot of people anecdotally seem to like them. A lot of bodybuilders seem to like them too. And it's something I've just used. I think at one point I was doing a lot of twice daily training. I haven't done that for a long time now, but I was using them as part of that strategy, and then I've just held on to them a lot. But it's unfortunate because you mentioned, obviously this was a prep application. And I think I'm completely with you that I think prep is probably one of the times where people would benefit most because, like you said, permanently like depleted. It's probably the one time you also don't want to like have liquid calories, which is frustrating. Did you consider just doing the old swig and like spit out? It's not super practical, I would imagine.
I didn't. I don't have a good explanation as for why. So I could have successfully implemented it theoretically because I do a lot of my training at home. So it's like, I don't have to worry about feeling self-conscious of people, gazing at me as I make my way to like the trash can to like spit out the Powerade I just consumed. So I could have done it in peace and quiet, but for some reason I didn't. I just like made the decision to like, pull some carbohydrate from like these other places to just put like 20-25 grams in Intra-Workout.
No, I had the immediate thought that comes to mind, and I imagine this could have is bulimia. That's like the thing that comes to mind is like, hey, people seeing this really lean individual like in prep, and then they're like spitting out this thing into the like toilet or wherever they're going into the bin. It's like, hey, this person has a problem, and I don't know. I worry. People even worry about like refeeds having like it's like, hey, this could be linked to binge eating behavior. I'd worry if someone started implementing this swigging of the carbohydrates, like it's a little bit bulimic like. So I think, and also there's theory that having the carbs there is probably a good idea too for the reasons you outlined. Are there any other supplements around the workout that you have experimented with and particularly like?
So I am a certified caffeine. I consume a lot of caffeine. I have a very high tolerance for caffeine. I don't experience the side effects other people experience from like really high intakes. Like I've consumed like over 1,000 milligrams at like multiple points in my life, and I just like don't get like the jitters or the nervousness or anything else like that. Like for me to sense an ergogenic effect from caffeine, because like I'm someone who needs like 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, which is basically, that is the upper end of the range, which the research consistently shows to have some sort of ergogenic effect. Whereas I have friends who are like, they're bigger than me by like, 20, 30 pounds, and they'll have like a monster, 140 milligrams of caffeine. They're like, dude, couldn't have more than one. And I'm like, what? Like, this is like drinking water. I don't understand what you mean. So I definitely utilize caffeine, and yeah, I mean, caffeine just helps for physical performance generally. There's this, for like whether it's endurance, muscular endurance, even just like peak power, all of these different aspects, there's like at least a small effect size. But like at the end of the day, I just like how caffeine makes me feel. Like that's why I take it. But like, yeah, the data's there to show that it might help your lifting performance. Other than that, I take creatine. And that might just be like more of a habit at this point, to be honest with you. And it's just like, yeah, like, it's probably the most research behind it in terms of supplements for lifting to improve strength and body composition, except for the fact that there's that recent meta-analysis that Schoenfeld and Alan Aragon were on. Are you familiar with that? I think Burke was the first author, and they looked at studies that only use like direct measures of muscle hypertrophy as opposed to like lean mass or whatever from DEXA. They were using like, so it had to be like ultrasound muscle thickness measurements and stuff like that. There's actually no significant effect of combining creatine with resistance exercise. So it's like, oh, maybe it doesn't do much besides like make you hold a little bit more water. Maybe it doesn't do all that much, but it's just like at this point, the research for creatine has been expanding in all these different directions. When it comes to brain health, there's even like a little bit of stuff for like glycemic control, and just like healthy aging in general. I actually recently wrote an article, for example, it's not out yet, but it was basically looking at the body of evidence concerning creatine and cognitive function. So whether supplementing with creatine enhances cognitive function, and the data is mixed, but there is some pretty compelling evidence when it comes to scenarios of elevated stress, right? So like in situations of sleep deprivation or like very complex energy demanding cognitive tasks. Also hypoxic environments. There's been at least one study looking at that. And in those situations, the effect of creatine on cognitive function seems to be it's more consistent and of a larger magnitude than if like you're just like a healthy young adult supplement with it. Also, older adults seem to benefit more from it when it comes to cognitive function. So when you look at like just the general health benefits of creatine, like I think it makes sense to supplement, especially if you happen to be someone who doesn't consume foods that are rich in creatine. So if like you consume a plant-based diet, if you're a vegan, if you're a vegetarian, not much, if any, dietary creatine there. So, and there's been at least, I think there's one study in vegans and vegetarians that found that supplementing with creatine enhanced cognitive function. So that might be a population of interest where it makes even more sense to supplement with creatine. But it's like, yeah, at this point, can I say like, hey, if you want to maximize increases in muscle size and strength, like you need to supplement with creatine? It's like I think it probably helps a little, like, you know, like it's still there. But again, like that recent meta-analysis is like, oof, that was a major blow to creatine. Have you discussed that on the podcast?
I haven't discussed it. I don't know if it was one of those where I was just like, man, this is the one thing we had as naturals that could like actually do something little for us. And I was just like trying to brush it aside a little bit. So I think that's what I ended up doing in my head. I was just, and also for the same things you said here, where it's like, hey, there's so many other benefits of creatine that I'm still comfortable recommending it to people for because everyone's interested in health generally. And it seems like there's multiple reasons that it could also help there, which is really cool. That's also a factor. And it's quite nice that your supplementation is pretty simple. I don't know why, as part of someone to examine, I thought maybe like you look at all the supplements and or many of them, and maybe you'll be more likely to try things. I'm not sure if that would have been. It's clearly not a fair assumption, but
that's a really interesting point. You know what? I think on average, that's what someone would expect of someone who works at Examine. You know, we read through nutrition and supplementation science every single day. You know, we're aware of the latest research on these things. So it's like, oh, you're probably taking a lot of supplements because like you're aware of and it's like, you know, it might be the other way around for me actually, because I'm always reading this data and because I'm just like, and because I have, you know, a pretty good understanding of research methodology. I'm just like underwhelmed by the data for most of these supplements. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think it's worth spending my money on that. So for example, I did a little bit of homework for this podcast, Steve, since you gave me the outline ahead of time. I did a little bit of homework and you mentioned, you know, whether there is anything interesting on nitrates recently. Another thing I looked at was beta alanine. You know, has anything interesting come out regarding these supplements? Because these have always been like fringe supplements in the field, where it's like, yeah, give you a little bit of something, but like, does it really work? There was one fairly recent, I think it was published in 2023, beta alanine study. It was, I think, the first like longitudinal intervention study that looked at changes in muscle thickness over time from daily supplementation with beta alanine. It was by Camargo, I think it's how it's pronounced. It was actually the same author as the one who ran the study that looked at whether like utilizing a strength phase before hypertrophy phase, like do you remember that study?
Yes, yeah.
People were like freaking out about that one a few years ago, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that went past quite quickly.
Yeah, no one talks about it anymore, huh? I think it was the same lead author, and basically it was in like resistance trained participants, which in the research saying these are people with like 5.5 years on average resistance training experience. They could squat like 1.25 times their body weight, bench their body weight, And they found that there were no differences in muscle thickness measurements, 1RM strength or muscular endurance, which was like 60% of 1RM in reps of failure. Like beta alanine didn't enhance any of these outcomes. And then I was like looking at, I was like, yeah, but they're also resistance trained. It was only 8 weeks. Like, do we have the technology to be able to, that is sensitive enough to detect like very small changes in muscle size, and then also be able to detect a statistically significant difference between groups? And I was like, so yeah, maybe that wasn't the case. But then they also like tracked changes in training volume, and it didn't even like enhance training volume compared to the placebo. So I'm like, yeah, there's probably nothing going on here. So beta alanine doesn't look great. At least in terms of like getting jacked and strong. Like for other things like combat sports, like could be useful. The other one's nitrates, and I mean there's some stuff. It's a really small effect size though. Like there was a recent meta-analysis looking at they actually just looked at studies that had interventions that utilized like the bench press or back squat, which I thought was interesting. Like usually it would be like a meta-analysis on like peak power and muscular endurance. And they're like, no, just the bench press and back squat. And they found a moderate effect size for increasing reps to failure for nitrate supplementation beforehand. So that was interesting. There's also a meta-analysis showing that was like, it's like a small, like I think it was a 5% increase in peak power output with nitrate supplementation. So it's like, it's there's a small effect there, but I don't know if you've ever looked at like how much beetroot juice shots are, which is usually what they're using in these studies. These things are expensive.
Yeah, I've looked.
These things are expensive. And it's like for small effect size, and this is effect size comparable to like caffeine, which is much cheaper, especially if you're just like drinking coffee or something. So that's kind of a downside. Like personally, I don't supplement with nitrates. The approach I take is I consume a nitrate-rich diet, and it's like we don't really have much evidence showing that that's equally effective. To my knowledge, there's been one study that looked at implementing a high nitrate diet. I think it was a 6-day intervention, and so the diet contained basically like I think it was like 40 grams of raw spinach, and like had some like sauteed collard greens in it. Those are two like very rich. That was like the main difference. So they jacked up nitrate intake through those green leafy vegetables, and they looked at changes in repeated sprint ability. They looked at like the oxygen cost of exercise during like moderate intensity cycling or something. So not really of interest to your listeners probably. And then there was like this, they used like this knee extension protocol where it was, so they did maximal voluntary isometric contraction, and they did like intermittent contractions at like 70% of maximum. And they found that the nitrate rich diet increased power output in the second half of the sprints, right? So evidence for like a little bit of like a muscular endurance effect there. And then the same thing with the intermittent submaximal isometric contractions. Basically, they found that like the high nitrate diet, they were able to do like 42 of those until they fatigued, and like 32 on the control diet. So again, like some more evidence of a benefit for muscular endurance from consuming a high nitrate diet. But again, it's just like, it's one study, really small sample, but like it's promising. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, like consuming more green leafy vegetables is like probably just good for overall health. And it's like, throw some more of those in, even if you don't notice an effect on your resistance exercise performance. Maybe your blood pressure improves a little bit. It's like, why not just go for it?
Yeah, I think that's well described. And beta alanine, that was one, again, evidence, like it was an evidence-based supplement for the longest time, and bodybuilders were taking it. And I still remember the episode where I spoke about it to Mike, and I was like, oh, maybe it would be useful in like a metabolite phase, because like it would help muscular endurance. And he was like, hey, it's probably buffering the things you're like trying to accumulate during a metabolite phase. And I was like, oh shit, maybe. And he was just like, hey, there's no research showing that it helps muscle hypertrophy. It's not something I recommend. And then I never looked back, and I haven't taken the itchy supplement since. So it doesn't surprise me that recent study, and I think that, like you said, it's like there hasn't been many studies looking at actual kind of what is the impact on muscle hypertrophy, and theoretically, like we're not doing that sort of like level of endurance that maybe it would have that positive effect, and maybe even it's buffering the things that we're trying to accumulate. Who knows? And then the same, but the one on nitrates, that's one that I've just seen getting more and more popular. And I have looked at like, hey, how much beetroot do I have to eat? How much, like, what's this beetroot juice? And I've even looked at like buying some tablets and stuff. And I'm just like, I just haven't committed to doing it. And also Eric Trexler put out something from Mass. It was a study that showed like mouthwash, like nullified some of the effects. So if you're using mouthwash like regularly, you end up somehow like potentially nullifying the effects. And I was currently using mouthwash, and I was just like, for God's sake, like I'm going to wait on that one until I run out, and maybe I have to look at how much spinach I have to consume, because that is something that, like, when you wilt spinach down, it becomes like nothing. So it's super easy to eat, or you can put it in like a smoothie or something, it just disappears.
I actually, because again, I told you I'm a bit neurotic.
You got the quantities.
A little bit of OCD there, so I can tell you in my notes right now. So the high nitrate diet contained 40 grams of raw spinach, 80 grams of collard greens, and then there was 130 grams of banana. Banana's not rich in nitrate, but it was like, this was in comparison to the control diet, right? So the high nitrate group had the banana, whereas the control diet had orange juice, which has nothing. The banana has like a trivial amount. So like, you know, like that's how they scale the difference there. And then half a liter of pomegranate juice, also like not that rich. And again, it's really beetroot and green leafy vegetables that are super rich in nitrate. So again, 40 grams of raw spinach, 80 grams of collard greens they used in this study, and that like accounted for over 3/4 of the increase in nitrate content. Something potentially to take into consideration with nitrate. There's actually one that I was just working on for the sports nutrition study, for the sports nutrition quiz for the month at Examine. There's this cool new study that came out that sought to determine whether the effect of nitrate supplementation was affected by baseline dietary nitrate intake, right? So something that a lot of these studies haven't considered, right? They're just like, hey, take this beetroot juice shot before you work out and let's see what happens. And it's like, yeah, that's interesting. But like, what if the participant was already consuming a high nitrate diet at baseline? Like, does supplementing with more nitrate actually help? And in this one, small study, but they basically found that people who consumed a diet that was low in nitrates, they all benefited from nitrate supplementation. But they looked at, like, the test was like this 12-minute running test. So it was like, how much distance, like how much work can you achieve in 12 minutes of running? And it was like, so nitrate enhanced that, like, would it have the same effect, you know, on resistance exercise performance in people with a low nitrate? Like, I don't know, maybe. But again, like there is data showing that it can benefit resistance exercise performance. We take this new study in consideration, showing that the effect seems to be most notable in people with a low nitrate intake. So I think like there's 15 participants, 13 of them had like pretty darn low nitrate intakes, and 12 of them saw an improvement in performance, right? And the 2 people who had very high dietary nitrate intake, they didn't see any benefit performance. And if anyone's paying attention to the numbers there, there's one person who had a low nitrate intake who did not benefit from supplementing with nitrate. And the interesting thing about that is that that person was the most highly trained participant in that study. He had the highest VO2 max of the participants, and he also performed the best on the running test. And there is prior research showing that in like very highly trained athletes, that the effect of nitrate supplementation is like marginal or non-existent. So the benefits seem to be higher in like recreationally trained or anything else. So there are some factors that are play with. So like, I'm like, overall, probably not worth your money. If you already have a high dietary nitrate intake, probably especially won't have an effect. And then if like you're highly trained, I don't know if this applies to resistance exercise, right? So it's like, if it did apply, I'd be like, hey, Steve, based on your training status, like it's not going to do anything. But ultimately, they have to figure it out. But yeah, there's some interesting factors to consider in there.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting, because I imagine a lot of the people who are looking for this, I don't know, you kind of go through a phase of trying every supplement. You don't even think about what you're having, and then you kind of really pull back, and then it's for those people who, like myself, doing it for a long time. You're like, man, is there anything I could keep my eye on stuff just in case there's any like 1%ers I can get hold of? Yeah. And it's like, hey, no, for a well-trained individual, it's unlikely to be as beneficial. And I think your point on prior kind of dietary nitrate consumption is super important, because it's actually something I was just discussing with Brad Schoenfeld and Milo Wolf and Dr. Pack about these high volume studies, which I'm sure you've seen, like the 52 sets of quads, kind of crazy. And something they did really well in that study was they had like a washout period. They already accounted for their previous training volume. They had a washout period. They had a familiarization phase. Whereas some volume studies, like some people are going up in volume, down in volume based off prior.
Right.
It's like similar here, where it's like, hey, if someone's coming down on nitrate intake versus up, like that's going to influence the result. So I do think the more I talk to researchers or people who understand research, the more I really realize how like, hey, you really can't just take one research study at face value. You have to understand like all these ins and outs and moving parts, and it's why I'm so glad I can talk to people like yourself who understand that could influence results. Whereas again, you could get someone who just isn't aware of that. We've been speaking for quite a while, Mike, and I'm just aware that I have plenty more questions for you. And I know you said you prepared, so I'm kind of thinking, rather than try and like, it might take another hour to get through the rest of these, we could talk at another time, and because they're quite training related, which I think would be a good little kind of episode in its own right. How do you feel?
Dude, honestly, it just depends on your schedule. So fun fact about Examine, we have Fridays off. So I kind of just planned my day around this podcast. So it's up to you, man.
Cool. Well, I think Fridays are a good day for me. So I think we can plow it into another episode, because I think we did a good job of talking through your prep, talking through like this element of supplementation. So I think it'll make a good additional episode. I know you've done the work for it, so
I have.
We can definitely book that in, because that will be a nice episode to kind of tie in things as well. So yeah, I want to say a massive thank you for you taking the time, and it was really interesting hearing about your backstory and those like little insides and outs. And I know a lot of the listeners, they're competitors or thinking about it, so I think it gives them some really good perspective. So yeah, thank you for taking the time. If people want to keep an eye on kind of maybe your competitive endeavors and your training, and a lot of the stuff that I've drawn from is from Mike's Instagram. So kind of every now and then you're putting out some really kind of interesting studies and takes on those studies and kind of reviews. So I'm kind of bigging up your Instagram as one place people can go, but where else? If your Instagram, give them that, and then if there's anywhere else.
It's really just Instagram and then like Examine. Like you can't like follow me individually on Examine, but like you'll come across pages and stuff, and it'll say like I'm the lead author. So like you'll find my work there. And then my Instagram is, I think it's just my name, RD, Mike Murry RD, so registered dietitian. I like go through these phases where like I put out content pretty consistently. I haven't put out content in a while, but when I do, it's usually something that I've read like some really interesting research about recently, and then it's like a long-winded post, and then there's probably a reference list attached to it. So basically, like if you're not on Instagram, just to like look at like clickbait posts and like quick whatever, and like you actually want some robust, substantial content about nutrition, exercise, and stuff, and like give me a follow at Mike Murry RD.
Sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. She's like making. Can you hear? I don't know if you can hear that.
I just heard it. Yeah.
She's having a dream. So I agree. Like I think the majority of people who are on Instagram probably aren't interested in that content, but a lot of the listeners here probably are interested, because they're the type of posts that you would save and like refer to and kind of read through. So thank you again, Mike, for coming on. I'll make sure all of those things are linked in the description box below. And thank you guys for listening. We'll talk to you soon.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality and we know how to do it. And we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.